Hi, Richa. Sorry to interrupt. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Oh, so here I am again. Myself, Richa, and I am Education Support Manager at ACCA. And good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on from where you are joining us for this TX InFocus webinar support for December 2025 exams. So this session is focused on make your marks, quick wins, and study strategies. This will help you learn how to get those marks you can secure quickly with smart exam techniques and focused practice. Moniza Siddiqui has joined us today to deliver this session and help explore effective exam techniques, discover smart strategies, dealing with time management during exam, and talking about what and how to focus on studies and practice during the last few weeks of your exams. Moniza is FCCA and holds MSc in Professional Accountancy from University of London. She has more than 20 years of experience and specializes in UK taxation and performance management stream of ACCA papers. You can always access the detailed profile of Moniza in the speaker's bio section of your webinar page. So during this session, Moniza will be covering some of live questions also from you, which you will keep putting in Q&A box during the session. So before I hand things over, I would like to briefly run through a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are a number of buttons you can use. So you will need to make sure that you select both slide and media player icons because you will need to view both of them throughout the webinar. Use the chat function, which you are already doing, I believe, with fellow participants, but please do avoid sharing any personal information in the chat. Look for the icon that resembles like a file, and clicking on this will give you access to helpful materials which are very much related to today's session or TX paper, which include direct links to several important exam resources. Feel free to move things around your screen and resize the windows however you like. And if you are not able to hear us at any time or you are not able to see the visuals, please do refresh your browser. By registering for this webinar, you will get an email tomorrow with all the details on how to watch it again. So do not worry if you miss anything or run into technical issues, you will be able to catch up with the recording later. I'm going to hand over to Moniza in a moment and will be back with you towards the end of the session. In the meantime, if you want to ask ACC a question or Moniza a question, then please post them in Q&A box. And we'll also like to remind that we may not be able to respond to everyone individually through web chat or verbally, but we will do our best to share questions and answers that are helpful for everyone. Handing over to you, Moniza.
Thank you, Richa. And hello, everyone. I hope you're having a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending upon where you're at. But thank you for joining me for the Tax in Focus webinar for the December 25 exam attempt. As Richa has already highlighted, the objective for today or the theme for today is to identify how you can maximize your marks in the tax exam by covering certain quick wins and study strategies. So jumping right into the agenda for today, what we'll be covering in today's session is certain exam techniques. Right, so we'll be looking at certain techniques that you can apply in the tax exam, and we'll be looking at this with examples. We'll be talking about certain smart strategies that, again, should help you achieve the easy marks that you can score in tax. And of course, time management is a very, very crucial aspect. So when the time pressure's on, how to make the most of the time that is allotted to you, that there are certain guidelines that we'll be talking about regarding that. And we will be covering a suggested 2 to 3 week study plan. So from today onwards, what are the planning steps that you can take to make the most of the time that you have before the D-Day? All right. And we'll be wrapping it up with the live question answer session. So please do keep the questions coming. I will definitely be more than happy to answer any questions that you have related to the tax exam. And so I'll be taking these up right towards the end of the session. So since we are, again, a slightly time-pressured environment, I'm going to jump directly into the first agenda point, which is exam techniques. Now, we have got exam techniques, and I've listed down certain guidelines that cover not just the objective type questions, but for the constructive response questions as well. And we'll be looking at guidelines that are specifically focused for numerical questions and for theoretical ones. But before I talk about any of the exam technique, just a crucial reminder that for your technique to actually take effect, for you to maximize your marks using the techniques, you definitely need to have the tax knowledge in, right? And it's not just the knowledge aspect, you also need to know how to apply that knowledge. And that is something that can only come through with sufficient exam level practice. And one additional aspect which is available in the tax exam, it's not true for all other exams across the board. We do have certain other papers that provide you certain information in the exam. But with the tax exam, you've got a very, very useful tool, which is the tax tables. So I will, of course, be bringing up how you, or at what point you should be referring to the tax table, because that can actually ease a lot of the knowledge pressure off your shoulders. So for that, you definitely need to have gone into the exam knowing what information will be available to you in the tax tables itself. So if you're able to get these three essentials done, and that can definitely be achieved with, of course, proper study and practice, a lot of the techniques that I will be covering today or suggesting today will help you achieve those easy marks as well as achieve success in the tax exam. Okay, so starting with the techniques for numerical OTQs. Right. So with the numerical objective type questions, whether you're dealing with them in section A or section B of the exam, right, the ideal approach is to first and foremost read the requirement. Now, I understand that because OTQs normally have a very short background information provided, a lot of candidates tend to just start with the scenario and then come to the requirement. My suggestion is always to start with the requirement, which is, of course, provided in bold, because that will help you pick out the relevant information even from that short scenario, or it will keep you focused. So once you've read the requirement, you've understood what the examiner wants from you. When you start reading the background or the scenario, you're able to keep your attention focused on what you need to achieve or provide to the examination team. Because we're talking about numerical objective type questions, you can then consider whether the use of tax tables would be helpful in this particular question or not. And again, that is something that you can decide if you already have a clear idea of what information, what rates, etc. are provided or available in the tax tables. So you've got plenty of time to go through a tax table, understand what standardized information is available to you, and make use of it when available in the exam. Don't just rely on your memory. So even if you've covered sufficient practice and you know that the basic rate is 20%, well, that's a pretty basic example. But if you are ever in doubt and you know that information is available in the tax tables, just take a moment, open up the tax table, make sure you've got the right rate and apply it. Okay. Now, the next step, of course, is to attempt the question. So once you've read the requirement, you've said, right, do I need to use the tax table or not? You then need to attempt the question. But before you submit your answer or you move on to the next question, I suggest rereading the requirement. So once you've worked out your answer and you just selected the final option, just make sure that you reread the requirement to make sure that you've actually covered what the examination team wanted. Right? This is especially true, for example, in a scenario where you've got information for multiple tax years. So, you could have been asked information for a particular tax year. And so it doesn't hurt if you just quickly reread the requirement and make sure that you've indeed picked out information for the relevant tax year and worked out your answer accordingly. Now, jargon is also very, very important. And if you're comfortable with it, it can help you solve the question quicker, rather than taking a long form about, or even, of course, solving the question correctly. To explain this with examples, I have taken an extract from the March-June 2025 examiner's report. All right. So what you have in front of you is an OTQ that, and again, I'm starting purely from the requirement. What amount of Class 1A national insurance contributions are payable by B Limited in respect of ELSA for the tax year 24-25? Now, the key requirement, of course, is amount of Class 1A national insurance contributions. Now, the knowledge aspect for you is for you to know that Class 1A NIC is applicable on what amount, right? So for those of you who have already covered this chapter, you would know this topic, that Class 1A NIC is actually calculated on only the taxable benefit amount. Now, if you know that, when you start reading the scenario, you can pick out the fact that while the first bullet point, which is a private gym membership, is possibly relevant, the second bullet point, which is a contribution of £1,800 into ELSA's private pension scheme, is irrelevant for this purpose. So the first thing I did, read the requirement, and then when I read the scenario, I was able to pick out the relevant piece of information rather than picking up all the numbers simply because they're there. Now, I'm not actually going to solve this question, right? So what I'm trying to focus on are the key technique points or the key aspects that you should be considering when attempting this OTQ. So you've got the requirement, you've picked out the relevant information from the scenario, and because we are dealing with Class 1A NIC, I know that this information, the information about the NIC rates, is available in the tax tables. Now, in the live exam, right, if you were to focus on the bottom left of your screen, you have got the help/tax table tab. And if you select that tab, what happens is that a window pops up, which includes the tax rates table, right, or the information. And within that, you scroll down to the relevant section and you've got information on the national insurance contribution rates. And within that, of course, we've got Class 1A highlighted, that Class 1A, no slabs needed, whatever amount is taxable for Class 1A, the rate of 13.8% is applicable. So use the tax tables, simply apply 13.8% on the relevant figure, and you have your answer. Okay. Moving on to the next point, like I said, that we need to be careful of the terms or the jargons being used. I'll try and explain this again with an example. So this is an extract from the March-June 2022 examiner's report. We've got a numerical OTQ, and the requirement is, what is Brian's capital gains tax liability for the tax year 21-22? Okay. And if we refer just to the highlighted information, we've been provided employment income, not taxable employment income, which means that the personal allowance amount that is available for income tax purposes has not been adjusted against this figure. And then we've been given chargeable gain amount from the sale of an antique vase. And again, the term chargeable gain means that the annual exemption amount has not been adjusted. Because if the personal allowance had been adjusted against employment income, the term would have been used taxable employment income. And if the annual exemption had been adjusted against the chargeable gain, the term here would be taxable gain amount. Now, this is important for you to know, because when you start solving this question, you need to recall that you will have to adjust the personal allowance amount against employment income. And why is that relevant? Because once we have the taxable employment income, we can then identify how much of the tax slab, the income tax slabs, have been utilized by our taxable income. And then when we pick up the gains, we of course need to work out the taxable amount rather than the chargeable amount and use that or insert that in the tax slabs to apply the correct tax rate. And it's not just something that I have sort of, suggested. It's something that the examiner has highlighted in their report. So in the solution, they've clearly highlighted that employment income, so if you look at the first highlighted line, 43,000, which was the employment income, less 12,570, which is the personal allowance adjusted. And then in the next paragraph, again highlighted, we've been told that the chargeable gain of 18,000 needs to be reduced by the annual exempt amount. Now, I do want to highlight that since this is a past exam paper, the annual exemption amount that has been used for capital gains purposes is 12,300, whereas for your exam attempt for the current Finance Act, the relevant annual exemption rate is 3,000. Okay, so just be very careful of this. This is just an example. That how, being careful of the jargons or the terms being used could lead to you arriving at the correct answer. Okay. Looking at the incorrect options, because the examiner's report not only gives you the explanation of the correct answer, but they also explain how the other distraction options could have been arrived at. We can see that for the first question, if the students did not adjust the annual exemption amount, they would have arrived at the amount of 2,873. Similarly, if they did not account for personal allowance, they would have led to other incorrect answers. Okay, so when you look at the answer options that are available all in all, know that of course you'll have one correct option, but the rest of the options are also plausible. And these plausible options are worked out by the examination team because they have years of experience and they know exactly what the pitfalls are for candidates. So they know, that a student would probably ignore the use of annual exemption or personal allowance, and that could lead to an impact on the final answer. Okay. Moving on to the next point, we now come to some guidelines for theoretical OTQs. So if you've got a narrative or a theoretical objective type question, what you can apply is the elimination technique. Now, this is not true necessarily for every type of question, every theoretical question, but it is true for majority of them where you cannot arrive directly at the correct answer. And we'll be looking at an example for that. Also, of course, as mentioned before, you need to be careful of distractors. So coming to the elimination technique method, if we look at the requirement here, the requirement which is not highlighted, but which of course is bold, is which of the three companies will be treated as resident in the United Kingdom for corporation tax purposes. Okay. Now, immediately what should come to your mind is the criteria for UK residency for a company, right? Now, if you look at the list of options, we've got different companies. For in option A, we've got a single company. For option B, we've got a single company. But then option C and D increases the number of companies as the answer option. Now, if you go back to the scenario, and if you only focus on the first bullet point, which is X Incorporated, which is incorporated overseas and holds its board meetings in the UK. Right? Now, at this point in time, you're applying the knowledge that you already have regarding UK residency criteria. And you know that a company either needs to be physically set up in the United Kingdom or even if it's incorporated overseas, if its central control and management is within the UK, it will be considered as UK resident, right? So applying that criteria, you can immediately pick up that X Incorporated should be a UK resident company. And once you've cleared that, you'd know that option B, your limited only, is to be eliminated because that answer option excludes X Incorporated as a UK resident company, and we've just picked up the fact that it is indeed a UK resident company. Similarly, when you move on to the second bullet point, which talks about your limited, we are told that it is incorporated in the UK, and that's more than enough for us to know that this is a UK resident company. Again, applying the concept that your limited is UK resident, we apply the process of elimination and we exclude option A as the correct answer because that excludes your limited as a possible option. Right? So what we're basically doing is that we're applying the knowledge to the scenario, but then we're also using that to eliminate the incorrect answer option. So I know by now that answer option A and answer option B are incorrect. So it is either going to be option C or D because both option C and D are considering X and Y to be UK resident companies. Of course, like I said, we're not really attempting all of these questions in total. We're just trying to pick up on the key guidelines. So again, apply the elimination technique for the theoretical questions, and you can arrive at the correct answer if it's not obvious from the get-go. Okay. All right. So moving on. Right. Sorry, these were the animations. Skipped them. All right. Coming to the guidelines for numerical constructive response questions. Now, there's slightly more guidelines when it comes to the constructive response questions, because obviously there's a lot more typing opportunity for you, and but that also gives you a lot of margin to score a lot of easy marks. Now, with numerical CRs, based on a lot of scripts that I've marked and picking up the insights from that, there's a whole list of guidelines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly list them down and then look at past exam paper examples to sort of reinforce the guideline. So starting with the first one, it is always suggested, or it's highly recommended, that you use the customized templates that are available. Right, so whether it is for the income tax computation, whether it is for corporation tax computation, whether it is for capital allowances or inheritance tax workings, there's a standardized way to approaching or presenting these workings. And it is always best that you stick to that with minor modifications or variations, of course, depending upon the information that's available. But the reason why I highlight that is because these recommended formats have a logical flow to them. And if you follow this approach, you are probably not going to make less mistakes. So you're not going to get confused in your own working and pick up the wrong figures, right? You're definitely going to be led through point by point, and incorporate pieces of information that perhaps are not specifically mentioned in the scenario. One common example is personal allowance. So personal allowance is rarely mentioned in an income tax liability question, but if you're following the recommended format for income tax computation, you would know that post net income you need to incorporate or insert personal allowance adjustment to arrive at the taxable income amount. So I can't reiterate enough on the importance of being comfortable presenting your information in the recommended formats, but that would be one of the strongest suggestions that I make. Okay. Next, of course, is following instructions. So not just reading the requirement, but sometimes and often enough now, the examination team will give you specific instructions that should be followed, because those instructions are to save you time or to direct you in to the right method of arriving at the answer that the examination team is looking for. So we'll be looking at an example for that. Now, when it comes to workings, this is definitely one of the key questions that students ask. To what extent should we show our workings? When it comes to CRs, the workings should all be there. But that does not mean that you really need to spend time showing each and every working in detail, or showing it as a separate working. So here on the slide, I've listed down some guidelines. So where the working is very, very basic, it's a simple percentage that you're working out, etc., you can simply use the spreadsheet formula. So in the destination cell where you want the final answer to be reflected, you can use the spreadsheet formula approach, and as soon as you hit enter, the final answer should automatically be calculated and it should show up in the destination cell. Now, when the marking team opens up your answer script, and if they see that you have arrived at a figure that's not part of the scenario and that you've definitely calculated, what they're going to do is they're going to go to that answer cell, that particular answer point, and they're going to be able to pick out the formula you've used by looking at the address bar, and that will give you the mark. Right? Even if you've got the final answer wrong. So for example, you got the percentage right, but you got the figure wrong. If there is either a half mark associated with it, you'll get at least that half mark because you've shown the working. Where the working is slightly lengthier, so you don't really want to complicate the spreadsheet formula by populating it with too much information, you can show it or mention it separately in your format, in your computation. And where, of course, the calculations are lengthy. So, for example, in the income tax computation, if you have to, determine the taxable employment income, it's best to always show it as a separate working, especially if there are a lot of, information provided around it. For example, salary, then bonus, then benefits, etc. So show that as a separate working and just cross-reference it, so that the examination team is very clear as to where you're getting your final employment income information from. So use labels, use headings, and cross-reference workings, and that that should make your answer script a very easy to read script. Okay, continuing with the guidelines. This is especially true for a lot of areas. When you are showing your calculations, you have to be very, very clear about whether that amount, that number, is a positive figure or a negative figure. So if it's being deducted, then you should ideally put it in brackets, or you should put a minus sign before the figure. So this should be very, very clear. All right. And so when you're using the spreadsheet formula of sum, if you have inserted the negative figures as a negative amount, it will automatically deduct the figure. So be careful about these things. These are very minor things, but they can have an impact on, of course, your final amount that you've calculated, and could lead to a loss of easy marks if you're not careful about these. Okay. When you're entering the data, you can expand the columns, you can format the numbers. So these options are available. And this is, again, something that you can play around with in this time when you're attempting your practice questions in a spreadsheet answer space or in a word processing answer space. You should ideally not be using a pen and paper. You should be typing up your answers right now to not only improve your typing speed, but also become familiar with how to use the different features of the spreadsheet answer space. Okay. For workings that have to be repeated, so for example, in a trading loss scenario where you have to sort of show your income tax computation for multiple years, or a corporation tax computation for multiple years, rather than showing each working separately for each year, you can create a table. Or of course, if you feel that, okay, we don't have too much of information and I would like it to be vertically laid out rather than on a comparative basis, then just use the copy paste feature. All right, so save time. You do not need to retype everything. So if you feel that the formula, the computation, the format that you've already typed up is going to be repeated, just copy paste it, modify it slightly as per the need, and just save time there instead of typing up the formats again and again. Remember, very, very important is that as far as the numerical CRs are concerned, the own figure rule applies. So even if you've got things wrong in the initial part, no worries. You can easily still get marks for that as long as the approach or the technique that you're using is correct. Of course, if the amount is so different that it's sort of put an end to your working at a very early point in the answer, as per the standard answer, then of course you're losing marks after that. But still, the own figure rule applies. So never ever consider an error in a computation to be the make and break deal. You will get marks. Right, so looking at certain examples, if you look at the extract from June 25 CR, first looking at the requirement, we were required to calculate Chica's tax-adjusted trading profit, and the requirement highlighted that this is an 8-month-long period of account. But then just below the bold requirement, you can see that there is a note, and this is the instruction that I mentioned earlier, right? This is the instruction by the examination team, and they've clearly said that your computation should commence with the net profit figure of 51,000 to 60. It's clearly mentioned over there, and indicate by the use of zero any items that do not require adjustment. Now, this is a very specific instruction, and it's an oft-seen instruction. In fact, every trading profit adjustments requirement now has this instruction attached. And in spite of that, you'll find that when you open the answer script, students have started with the income or the gross profit figure, right? So no, when it comes to attempting this question, you should start with the net profit amount. Okay, so as you can see over here, this is the extract of the standard solution. So we've started with the net profit amount, and then we've made adjustments. And then you can see that for the simple working, so for example, if you refer to car expenses, which is row 6, column B, we have just got the final figure of 520. But if I go to that particular cell, I'm able to see in the address bar the formula that led to this answer. Right? So as I mentioned before, if the examination team is able to see the formula, they will award you the necessary mark. Then you will observe that for row 9 and row 10, which is delivery van and car, there are the calculation or the formula has been mentioned within the same column, within the same row, in fact. And the reason for that is that's a slightly more technical working. So this is a slightly lengthier formula. So we have included that specifically. The negative amounts have been clearly indicated. So again, when I use the sum formula to arrive at the tax-adjusted trading profit amount, that will make things easier for me. It will save time. Okay. Moving on. Again, this is still the continuation of the extract of the standard solution, the complicated calculations. So we had a property income computation within part of the next requirement. So it's not part of the first requirement that we're just looking at. This is the second part of the same question, but we had to calculate, perhaps the taxable income for the individual, and we had a detailed working associated with property income. So instead of inserting that within the income tax computation, we've shown that as a separate working, and we've simply cross-referenced it. Right, so that the examination team is able to immediately pick out that if you've arrived at 6,580, so we need to refer to working, and the working will then show us how you've arrived at this amount. And again, own figure rule applies. Okay. Use the tabular format instead of duplicating the workings, as I've mentioned before. So this is a loss relief scenario. And what you can see over here is that instead of you retyping the format again and again, you've just used a tabular approach. And within the individual columns B, C, and D, you're able to just insert the relevant information. So this was actually a pre-populated or preset template that was provided in the exam. But if this was a blank space and you had to actually present your answer a loss relief scenario, then this approach would be best. Use a table. Okay. Coming to theoretical CRs. Now, when it comes to theoretical CRs, of course, reading the requirement is key. You should ideally always be reading the requirement regardless of the type of question that we're dealing with. But for theoretical CRs, it's best to break it down if required. And that is required when you've got multiple aspects to the requirement, right? So applying the rule of and, if you've got explain and suggest, so that means there are two parts to the requirement, and breaking it down will make sure that you have attempted all aspects of the requirement. Then you can copy paste from the scenario into the answer space if there's any particular aspect from the scenario that you can use as is without making a lot of modifications, right? So for example, if you want to create subheadings and you just want to pick up the requirement, copy paste it, split it down, and use that as a subheading or use that as an approach to make sure that you've answered all parts of the requirement. Very important focus on the verb, because with numbers it's very easy, it's very straightforward. You need to calculate something, but with theoretical aspects you need to focus on the verb, whether you have to list, whether you have to state, whether you have to explain, whether you have to advise, because each aspect will require a certain level of certain depth of information in your answer. Okay. For guideline, try and always present 1 to 2 points per mark, unless of course you've been told give two or state two disadvantages for a particular approach. Now that's very specifically two that has been mentioned by the examination team. In that case, you'll only give 2 bullet points. But if the narrative aspect is explain why, and you've been given 4 marks for that requirement, you've been allotted 4 marks for that requirement, then you should ideally try to present 1 to 2 points per mark. All right, so that could range from 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 points specifically to achieve the full marks. Of course, depending upon that, the extent of that information being relevant to the scenario. And that brings me to the next point. When you're presenting or when you're planning your response to theoretical CRs, is your response going to be generic or customized? That is also something that you can pick up from the requirement itself. Okay, and do not lose out on the easy marks. So often the requirement is calculate this and advise or conclude as to whether this approach is right or wrong, whether it is suggested or not. And what happens is that candidates tend to do the numbers, tend to do the explanation if it's a theoretical one, but they miss out on the easy mark, which is specifically to wrap up your answer by saying, so to conclude, or it is suggested or it is advisable, and you just whatever your answer is, it can be anything. It does not necessarily have to match the standard solution exactly. As long as your explanation is leading to that conclusion, you will get the mark. But a lot of the times students or candidates do not bring in the conclusion, which means that they lose the easy 1 mark, and it's normally 1 mark that's attached to the conclusion, and that that can be a difference between a pass and a fail. So now bringing these guidelines into examples, okay, we've got a requirement here. It's a theoretical one. We have to explain how and when, right? So applying the rule of and, this means that for this particular requirement, I need to answer 2 parts. Explain how, and also when. All right, so there are 2 parts to this. So because there are multiple requirements and there are multiple marks, I'll make sure that in my response, I'm answering both of these aspects. Then we have the next requirement, which is state when. And if you look at the requirement, the marks allocated is just 1 mark. And then the next requirement is explain to what extent. And again, even for this, we've got 1 mark. Now, the difference between the two is that state would be more precise, more concise, whereas explain would require a bit more detail, a bit more flesh to your narration. Okay, so looking at the standard solution for the first one, right, where we had to explain how and when. This was a generic requirement because it did not say explain how and when this individual has to achieve this particular objective. No, it was a generic question regarding NICs. And so you look at the response, we have mentioned the generic or the standard guideline for how class 1 NIC is calculated and by when it should be paid to HMRC, right? But we've split it because we want to score the full 2 marks allocated to this requirement. Next, if you look at C2 and C3, the points highlighted in yellow, you can see that both of these are customized response. And the reason why they're customized is because if you go back to the requirement and have a look at that, it specifically states state by when Garth will, for example, do certain things. And in the next part, they're saying explain how Garth will. Now, when they're bringing in the individual of the scenario, they're asking you to be very specific about your response. So you can't be generic here. You can't say, right, generally, we, have to submit an IC by this date. No, you look at the timelines provided to you for Garth and the individual in the question, and you actually answer or plan your answer accordingly. Okay. Now, complete statements instead of bullets. So whether it is state or whether it is explain, we have to make sure that we're not just throwing a bullet point on the answer script, right? We have to frame complete statements to get the full mark. All right. And a definite conclusion, because that was required. So you will score the easy mark associated with it. Okay. Moving on from the exam techniques, that's taken up quite a chunk of our discussion today. We'll now look at certain smart strategies that you can apply. Okay, so a lot of these points will be a repetition of what I've already covered in a bit more detail. It's just a reminder, because at this point in time, you've got the knowledge, you've probably already understood how to apply that. It's just a reminder of certain techniques that you should be conscious of when you're attempting the exam. Okay, so be smart in the exam, regardless of which section you're dealing with, whether it's section A, section B, or section C. You can very easily pick out on what is the easiest question, what is the question that you're comfortable with, right? So a lot of candidates, tend to ask whether we should focus on particular syllabus area, and it's very easy for me to gauge that they're not, for example, comfortable with inheritance tax, right? And as much as they would want to hear me say that, you can forget inheritance tax, unfortunately, that's not the case. Inheritance tax will be tested, as will capital gains tax, as will VAT, as will every other syllabus area. So when you go into the exam hall, you have to be prepared for the worst. But once it's done, right, what you can do is you can make your life easier, and you can alleviate some of your exam pressure by just attempting those questions that you're more comfortable with first. So once you start feeling, okay, I've got this many number of questions done, you feel the stress lifting a bit, and then you're able to focus, with a much more clearer mind, much more relaxed mind on the questions that you're not as comfortable with. And then you're less likely to make errors there. Okay. If you get stuck on a question, flag it and move on. Be very, very conscious of the time. So we'll be talking about time management in the next section, but be very, very careful about the time. So just flag it and then move on. Make sure that you've completed your exam. Do not submit an incomplete script. So, for OTQs, for example, just guess. Now, for OTs, I also recommend that you use the Scratchpad for your numerical workings, so that when you are in the process of rechecking it, which you should be able to do if you've got your time management under control, then you can easily go back to your working and see exactly how you arrived at your final answer instead of recalculating it at that time. Okay. Read the instructions and the additional information carefully. I've already covered that in depth, right? Do not lose the easy marks. Some examples that should not be followed. So, as I've already mentioned, you've been instructed to start your tax-adjusted trading profit computation with the net profit amount, but you started with the gross profit. It's a big no, okay? Next, you've been told in the scenario that the annual exemption, whether it is for capital gains, whether it is for inheritance tax, it has already been utilized. Yet, in your answer, you incorporate annual exemption. No. All right, so follow the instructions, read the scenario carefully, and highlight those points so that you don't make the mistakes when you're answering the question. Okay, in section C, it's ideal to follow the same sequence of the information as has been laid out in the scenario. So even when you're attempting your computation, just go in the same flow, so that will make sure that you do not miss out on dealing with any piece of information provided. And where a piece of information is provided and you're not taking into account any numerical effect for it, then you should include it, mention it in your computation, but just use the number 0, the numeral 0, to indicate that it does not have a numerical impact. Okay, so for example, this is just those points in example in front of you. You've got a trading profit adjustment scenario here. As you can see, so the left block is basically the question extract, and the block on the right is the standard solution. So you can see that in the trading profit adjustments against the income, the first expense adjusted was depreciation, then we had car expenses. And in the standard solution, that's exactly the sequence that has been followed. And then we had advertising expenses that has been included. Okay, so we're just reiterating that you should ideally follow the same sequence. Use of tax tables, I've already highlighted. I have mentioned that for the theoretical parts, you can copy paste from the scenario. In fact, you can copy paste the requirement as well and just split it into different parts. So you've got your subheadings, and then you can make sure that you've answered all parts. Within this standard, within your answer space, you can cut paste rather than retype the entire computation. So sometimes you start typing, you start creating a format, and you realize, oh, I'm running out of space here, right, because of some working or whatever it is. Remember, you can cut paste the entire working or the data that you've entered and move it to some other space within the answer or within the spreadsheet space or within the word processing space, rather than, of course, having to retype the entire working again. So be conscious of these things, be careful of these things, because you can easily manage your time. Okay, learn to work at the margin. This is important because sometimes the examination team has highlighted that an individual is a high rate taxpayer. I'm just going to highlight the standard solution over here. We had an individual for whom we had to calculate the income tax and NIC, and we'd been told that the individual was a high rate taxpayer. Now, instead of recalculating the entire income tax computation, all you really needed to do, if you look at the second bullet point, is pick up the relevant information and apply the 40% higher rate tax on it. And if you look at the examiner's comments, that's exactly what they've highlighted, that a lot of students lost easy marks here or lost marks because they did not work at the margin. Okay. Right, how to stay in control of your time in the exam. Remember, 1.8 minute per mark, all right? And that can only be achieved with timed practice. So for that, my key suggestion is attempt mock exams, because you'll be attempting the entire paper within the stated timeline, and that's important because you need to develop your stamina to be able to attempt a 3-hour paper, okay? Take your time and read through the questions to pick out the easiest ones first. Now in section A, the approach that we can take, and I'm just going to bring down all the bullet points here. 30 marks to be attempted, 54 minutes. Do not obsess on time per OTQ because it's a very fair spread of questions. Flag the question that you're facing challenges with, move on to the next one, and come back later. At the end of it, if you're moving on from the section, just guess your answer, and you can always come back to it later if you flagged it. In section B, we've got 3 cases. So again, 30 marks, 54 minutes is the guideline, 18 minutes per case. Attempt the case that you're most comfortable with first. Read the requirement. Pick up the relevant information from the case, right? Within this, because the 5 questions are independent, you can again use the flagging technique. Just flag the question that you're not comfortable with and come back to it later. However, I would suggest that before you move on to the next case, because that's a completely different scenario, it would be best for you to go back and give it one more go. And then again, the same suggestion applies. If you are at a loss, just guess your answer, but do not submit an incomplete script. Coming to section C, 40 marks. So that's 72 minutes. Now, within these 72 minutes, you're attempting a total of 3 questions. One is a 10-mark one, which should take you about approximately 18 minutes, and the remaining 2 are 15 marks each, so that's 27 minutes each. So this is a general guideline. Again, attempt the questions you're comfortable with first, break down the requirement to make sure that you've answered all aspects, and sometimes even within the requirement, you'll be comfortable with one part and not the other. Just, go with the flow, attempt the requirement, part of the requirement that you're comfortable with. If you're stuck, move on to the next part of the question and come back to it later. And remember, own figure rule applies. Okay, so reminder, pass mark is just 50. All right, so if you secure the 50 marks, you're good. All right, so don't obsess about having each and every figure in your computation to be the absolutely perfect figure or matched to the standard solution. Now, just quickly wrapping up with the 2 to 3 week study and revision plan. This is just a suggestion, people. Today, you've of course joined me for this webinar. So what you can start today, and this is assuming that you don't already have a study plan in place, create a manageable study plan. All right, so highlight the tricky concepts, so the concepts or the topics that you're not comfortable with, and focus on those right now first. Get them out of the way within this week. Use active learning, which means you need to create summary notes or learning maps. So for example, what you can see on the screen over here is a summary or mind map that I make when I'm listing down the rules or guidelines for benefits. So for non-job related accommodation, this is the mind map that I would make, and this is actually a summary that I can refer to before the exam, and that it just helps reiterate the knowledge to me, but in a easy to use format. All right. One suggestion that I do make is for the deadlines, because the deadlines is a piece of information that can be tested. It's an easy mark, but it's not given in the tax tables. So what you can do is that you can create a document that lists down the deadlines and just refer to it once or twice during the week. And so you'll be able to remember or recall it in the exam if the deadlines are asked for. Moving on, in the next week, which is the week commencing 17th November, carry out timed practice. So by this point in time, your knowledge aspects should ideally be covered. And in this week, if you've covered the tricky aspects, starting next week, you should be carrying out timed practice. You can review the technical articles because those are a good, summary or recap of your entire tax, because you've got technical articles on inheritance tax, you've got it on VAT, you've got it on capital gains tax. So those are a good refresher of the entire knowledge that can be examined. When I say entire, of course, the key examinable ones. And you can refer to examiner reports because, again, there's a wealth of information there. Self-mark to improve. This is important. So when you attempt the questions, make sure that you pick up the standard solution and mark your answers. So you're able to pick out as to where you're going wrong, and you're able to reassure yourself that even if you've got a figure wrong early on in the computation, you're still able to, apply the own figure rule and secure the rest of the marks and secure the pass mark, which is really what we're aiming for. Then coming to the final week, which is week commencing 24th November, ideal to only carry out timed practice. Okay, so again, I'll highlight that do attempt the mock exams because you need to develop a stamina so that you're able to attempt the paper non-stop for 3 hours. Okay, so do make sure that you're carrying out timed practice. But most importantly, self-care. Do not forget to rest well, eat well, and exercise as well. All right. So within these 2 to 3 weeks, and I'm sure if you're attempting multiple papers, the pressure is really, really on. But just make sure that you are important. Your mental health, your emotional well-being is equally important. And, the most peaceful you are, the more happier you are, the more motivated you are, the better you'll perform in the exam, regardless of how well or less well prepared you are. Okay. So with that, we come to the Q&A. All right, so I have got the questions here. Let me just have a quick look. Right. Okay, so we have a question. I'm to attempt the first ever paper. Any suggestion? If it's the first ever paper that you're attempting at the applied skills level, then 2 things that can become a possible tricky area is one, OTQs. Okay, because a lot of candidates feel, oh, these are short questions, we can easily score, but they're tricky, right? So you definitely need to make sure that you practice sufficient OTQs and you're able to pick out on how the examination team can sometimes word a question, and that can be a red herring. So just attempt OTQs a lot. So practice is primarily it, really, and practice with the aspect of getting familiar with how the knowledge is examined. And OTQs, of course, that's a very specific type or style of question that you need to get comfortable with. And with CRs, as I've already mentioned, there's specific guidelines that you can apply to make sure that your answer, satisfies the examination team. But what is also important is the fact that timed practice. If you time yourself when you're attempting the questions, you can definitely be more comfortable but be much more in control of your time in the live exam, which is very, very important. So just these couple of things I'd say. Practice questions, under timed conditions, use the standardized templates, pretty much a recap of what I've covered today. But that's primarily it. You need to get comfortable with the exam environment since it's your first ever paper. So definitely candidates who've attempted a live exam in this environment, they have an edge, but you can definitely overcome that by using the practice sets that are available on the ACCA practice platform. Okay. All right. Okay, till now, I did not get study all syllabus. Should I continue to study or start to practice? Well, it really depends, because that's a very generic statement that you've shared. Ideally, the syllabus should have been completed, but now you're best aware of what extent of the syllabus is left. I cannot, in all honesty, say you can skip the rest of the syllabus, because with OTQs, and especially how the exam is laid out, the entire syllabus will be examined. So what you need to do right now is just create a manageable study plan where you are, for example, now the topics that you're covering. So for example, I'm assuming that if you're going in a sequence of you're studying corporation tax, for example, right now, what you can do is that you can focus on corporation tax knowledge and carry out the practice simultaneously, but then create a study plan where you have a definite cutoff that by this time I would have covered the knowledge and the practice aspect of the syllabus area. And so the rest of the days, I can then go and practice the questions related to the syllabus areas that I've covered before. All right. And again, if you start attempting past exam paper questions completely, then that's, of course, going to be a practice of the entire syllabus. So that would be my suggestion. You can't skip any part of the syllabus. So definitely create a study plan, set a cutoff date, make sure that you first cover the remaining syllabus and carry out the associated practice simultaneously. So that's, one aspect of syllabus and practice covered, and then practice the rest of the syllabus areas later on. Okay. Okay, well, please take us through how to use the tax bands in income tax and how they also relate to CGT. Okay, it's a technical question. It basically means that you've got three slabs. You've got the basic rate slab that's up to £37,700, and then you've got the next slab that goes up to £125,140. Once you've worked out your taxable income, so for example, you've worked out your taxable income, right? So that's your income tax, that's your income from different sources, employment, profits, property income, etc. You've adjusted the personal allowance and you've arrived at, let's assume, £40,000. Now, £40,000 of taxable income, and I'm assuming it's all non-savings, okay? It would have completely used up your basic rate band of 37,700, and some of it will be spilling over into the higher rate band. Okay. Now, the tax rate applicable for the basic rate band is 20, and for the higher rate band, it's 40%. But at this point in time, for that individual, for that particular tax year, the next question you're going to ask is, okay, did this individual make any capital disposals, and is there any gain that this individual needs to pay tax on? Now, majority of the times the answer is no, even in the real world, because it's not a recurrent habit where candidates, individuals are disposing of capital assets every year or frequently. But let's assume in the current tax year, I've disposed of an asset and I do have a gain. And the first thing is that gain has to be the taxable gain amount. So I have to remove the annual exemption from the chargeable amount, arrive at the taxable gain, and let's assume that amount is 10,000. Now, this £10,000 taxable gain will now fall into the higher rate band, because in sequence, when you start utilizing the tax slabs, you first insert the income, the taxable income, and wherever it ends, that's where your capital gains or your taxable gains start utilizing the tax slabs. So when it falls in the high rate slab, of course, the associated tax rate will apply on the £10,000. Okay, I hope that sort of explains it. It's a bit difficult with the, having a pen and a paper to explain it to you, or, annotative screen. But yes, that's pretty much how it works. We always first tax the income and then use the same slabs to tax the gains. So wherever your taxable income has ended, that's where your taxable gains start getting taxed. Okay, but with capital gains, what's easy is that if it's falling in the basic rate slab, the tax rate is 10%. If it's falling in the higher or additional higher slab, it's 20%. So once you have determined which slab your taxable income has fallen in and ended at, you simply apply the relevant tax rate on the taxable gain. Okay. So I have to remove annual exemption from the chargeable gain to calculate the capital gains tax liability? Yes, but be very careful. Now, if the requirement was calculate the chargeable gain, now the term chargeable gain means before annual exemption. In that case, you do not deduct the annual exemption. But yes, if the requirement is calculate the taxable gain or calculate the capital gains tax liability, then for these two aspects, you definitely need to remove the annual exemption to arrive at the taxable gain amount and then calculate the tax liability. Similarly, if the requirement is related to income tax and the requirement states calculate the net income. Now, net income is before personal allowance. Then you do not need to adjust the personal allowance. This is a very rare scenario, by the way. They normally tend to go towards taxable income. But if they have said in the requirement, calculate net income, you do not need to show the personal allowance adjustment because you won't get any marks for it. But if the requirement is calculate taxable income, income tax liability, or income tax payable, then a personal allowance amount has to be adjusted, even if it's zero, because that can happen in the variations. And then you arrive at the taxable amount, which of course you tax. Okay. Is the table provided? Yes, the tax rates and allowances table is available. It's got income tax rates, it's got NIC rates, it's got capital allowances information, it's got car benefit information, it's got corporation tax rates, information regarding IHT, VAT. So it's a complete treasure trove, right? So again, if you go through it a couple of times, you'd know exactly what information is there because it's pretty standardized. It doesn't change from one exam attempt to the other. And so that will make things easier for you when you're attempting a question and you're thinking, did I get the rate right? And that personally, for me, that always happens with NIC, right? Because it's not a highly examined concept for me, for the questions I practice, for example. And so I'm always like, did I get the figure right? And so, I refer to the tax tables rather than trying to, recall that in the exam pressure. Take the pressure off, refer to the tax tables, make life easy. Okay, so yes, the table will definitely be provided, no questions about it. Which section would you recommend one starts with the exam, section C, then maybe end with section A and B? Again, a commonly asked question. I would strongly say this really depends upon your own comfort level, okay? Because it's really about how you actually attempt your full-fledged mock exam or practice exams in these weeks. So you can actually, play around with your strategy. So you could first attempt an exam starting with section A, B, and then going on to C, or you could mix it up and then see what worked best for you. So to each his own. I wouldn't say that there's a general rule of thumb as to which section you should go for first. So if you feel that you always spend too much time on section C, then I would suggest going to section A and B first because you need to manage your time. But if you feel that you take up too much time on section A and B and section C gives you a lot more scope for easy marks because that's where your comfort level is in terms of presenting detailed workings, etc., then yes, by all means, do start with section C. So I believe that was the repeat question. I've answered that. Work at the margin, what does that mean? Okay, so I'll try and slow it down in terms of the explanation just now. I'm sorry, Richard, please do let me know if you're okay time-wise. Just would like to answer this particular question. This is an important one. Okay, so for example, and this is normally a requirement that comes up in the 10-mark question that you have for section C. So because that's a slightly higher skill testing question. So they'll give you a scenario and they'll say, okay, so for example, Muniza has the option of setting up her has the option of, for example, getting a company car, or she can perhaps get an accommodation. And Muniza is an additional higher rate taxpayer. Now, what does additional higher rate taxpayer mean? It means that my taxable income is already falling in the highest slab possible. I wish, right? So it's already falling in the highest tax slab possible. So that means my current taxable income is being taxed up to 45% because that's the tax rate for additional higher rate taxpayers. Now, at this point in time, when I'm already at that level, I've been given the option of getting a company car or getting an accommodation. And of course, we've been given the taxable benefit amount for it, or we've calculated it. And now at this point, when you have to look at the tax impact of either alternative, because normally in these situations, the scenario is look at the alternatives, work out the tax impact, and then suggest what should Muniza opt for. So you work out the tax impact for the car and you work out the tax impact for the accommodation. But rather than calculating the entire income tax liability from scratch for the car option and then from scratch for the accommodation option, you simply say, okay, so if the car benefit is £900, we'll simply apply 45% to it. Why? Because we already know Muniza is an additional high rate taxpayer. So here, instead of recreating the entire tax liability computation, you've worked at the margin. And of course, that's only possible where that information is very, very clear cut, right? Similarly, if the accommodation benefit is £1,200, you can just, work at the margin, work out the tax impact, which is 45% on 1,200. Now, of course, this example was not the best one because even looking at the different amounts of 900 and 1,200, you could have easily said Muniza should opt for the car rather than accommodation because that's a cheaper option. But if you get my meaning, working at the margin simply means that you've been given information about the tax position of the relevant individual, company, etc., and you've been told that that individual company or the taxpayer basically is getting additional income, and so you can just apply the marginal rate rather than starting the entire working from scratch. Okay. Case topics. Normally, there are one of the case will relate to capital gains. I shouldn't say CGT because capital gains tax is specifically for individuals. So you could have a capital gains scenario which could be based on companies, right? So there's one on capital gains, there's one on inheritance tax, and then you can have one on value-added tax, which again could be relatable to an individual or a company. Okay, should we do the workings below our main computation? Yes, ideally we should. Sorry, Rich, I'm just rushing through the questions right now, but take over whenever. All right. Okay, and the rest of the questions are slightly more academic related. But yes, Richa, not sure. How many more questions can I take up? Please do let me know.
We are already on time now, so maybe just one more, whichever you feel the best. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we've covered that. Are abbreviations allowed in the exam? Yes. If you're ever in doubt, the suggestion I would normally make is that if you're going to be using that abbreviation multiple times, you could mention it once in detail and put in bracket the abbreviation and then just follow through. But quite frankly, as far as tax is concerned, TWDV, WDA, AIA, these are common abbreviations. So you can just insert them in the computation without any repercussions whatsoever. And I do apologize for the questions that I could not take up, but thank you. All right, over to you, Richa.
Thank you, Muniza. Thank you so much. That's great. I believe actually you have picked too many questions looking at the time we had for them. And suddenly we are just having too many of them coming in the inbox. So sorry for that. We cannot cover all the questions right now. But yes, definitely whatever you have covered or you have shared the information with the students will be beneficial to them. Before we close the session, just to remind everyone about this important exam preparation resources. One is ACCA practice platform. So mocks are there. You will get their debriefs on ACCA study resources YouTube channel and several other more videos, paper specific videos especially, which can help you in your exam preparation, and ACCA study hub, not less than that is also available for you for your exam preparation, exam practice, extra questions, quizzes, MCQs. You can all get there. So with this, we bring this session to a close. And as I said, we hope that you have found the session useful, and big thank you to each one of you for joining us today. Thank you so much, Muniza, and a special shout out to the team working behind the scenes to help make this session run smoothly. Thank you very much. Wish you all the very best for your exam preparation and exam uptake.
Thank you, Richa. Thank you, everyone, and all the best, audience. Best of luck. You can do it.